Hey, it's Ben. Back for another recording here. This time I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to record this just directly into StreamYard instead of streaming it, because I have quite a lot to cover here. And this way I can speak for a while and possibly pause the video to gather my thoughts, and then I could return. Now, and partly the reason why I want to do that is because I want to address something that's a little more controversial, or at least some aspects of what I'll be covering for this broadcast will be, or this recording, as I said. So today we're talking about, feasting, family feelings, and holding your shit together, a holiday special. Well, we just had Thanksgiving just a few days ago, and we'll be going into, we'll be coming up on Christmas and New Year's in just a few weeks' time. And it's such a loaded issue on so many levels. It impacts us in so many different ways, and our own individual experience is so unique from one person to another, depending on a lot of it, the kind of connection or relationship you have with your family, either your family of origin, or maybe you've started a family yourself, and just all these things to take into consideration here. So another thing too is I've had a little more challenge sleeping in the past few days, so maybe I feel a little more brain fog at times. Or if I don't flow from one thing to another, well, okay, I can't be on 24/7 all the time. But anyway, let me just tear into it and see where I can go here. So Thanksgiving is, it's a time, we get together with friends and family, and all the holidays for that matter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. These days, many of us are working long hours, commuting, and in times past, you had people tending to live closer to their family of origin and live within a certain range of where they grew up. There's more of a likelihood of them doing so. Of course, you think back, like when people were, many years ago, they were leaving Europe and coming to North America, for this new world. And so in those days, a lot of people left their families and friends behind. And at that time, there was no telephone. I don't imagine for a lot of them there was any kind of postal service. And so for some of them, it was like that was their final goodbye to friends and family members. But for us now, at this time in history, each year, we come up on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the New Year, and for many of us, it's a time to, if we're living off in some other part of the country, it's a time for us to get back together with friends and family. And for many, that can be a joyous occasion, especially if you do have a close or intimate bond with your family of origin, maybe the new family, if you have partnered up with someone and say you're raising a child or children and all. But there can also be a lot of ambiguity there, in the sense that although some of us grew up with families that are parents that were loving, nurturing, supportive, like even within the best of families, as we all have our moods at times. We all have times when we're stressed out, and we were doing the best we can, but it could be a little challenging sometimes. We can't always be there, 100%. And then there are those of us who, despite the fact that our parents loved us to the best of our ability, maybe we were subjected to emotional, sometimes even some physical, or even more horrifying sexual trauma, for instance. And so I know of many instances where, and I've experienced this myself here, you're going back for the holidays and you're seeing family members, and there's this long history of alcoholism and other kinds of crazy ass dysfunction. You're seeing individuals with whom you, at some point, you were on the receiving end of some kind of verbal, emotional, physical, or even being sexually abused, for instance. And that can be quite difficult to. Some of us would much prefer to never see some of our family members again for this reason. There's also, just even beyond that, just the dysfunctional dramas that play out in many of our families. For instance, one woman that I've worked with was very much scapegoated by her parents. And even though her parents have passed on, this dynamic is still, her siblings will get together, and the siblings have their own kind of closeness or what a dysfunctional connection. And yet this woman that I've worked with, she's still a lot of times not included, not invited, or if she is, it feels awkward. I know of other examples where when a parent or both parents died, there was fighting over the inheritance, and so there's a lot of animosity around that. And there's other families that are estranged. Oh, and right at the moment, as I'm making this recording from New York City, all I have to do is I walk out the door. I went for a walk late yesterday evening, and I'm walking by. Apparently, it's two people that were bundled underneath blankets. I mean, they were completely covered in, heavy blankets, quilting. And so there are a lot of people do not have a home to go to, or even if you are fortunate enough to be housed, you have a home to go to. There's many of us did not have anyone with whom we could celebrate the holiday, or at least share a meal. There are people living in their cars. There are animals, dogs and cats that are in shelters all over the country. Sadly, many of these dogs and cats are euthanized. It's, my heart aches. I would so much love to see these, all these animals, dogs, cats, and all, just to be taken in, to be given homes. But sadly, this is not the world we're living in for so many. And getting together with family over the holidays, it can be stressful for some of us, because as we spend time with our families, we're having Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's dinners. Sometimes family members are not the most respectful of boundaries. They're not that considerate. Sometimes they say or they do things that are pretty invasive, grossly insensitive. They trigger some of our deepest vulnerabilities. And in more recent decades, it's become much more polarized here in the United States. Going back to when I was a very young child, some of my earliest memories were sitting in front of the television set during the nightly news in the late 60s, and Walter Cronkite giving reporting on the war in Vietnam. And, in that stoic voice saying, for instance, 5 were killed today in heavy fighting along the Vietnam-Laos border, or the Cambodian-Laos border, that is. And even seeing combat footage. And for a young child that can be very disconcerting, very upsetting. You realize that people are fighting and dying and suffering terribly. And even by the age of 10, I was thinking, by the time I turn 18, or as soon as I turned 18, my ass is heading to Canada. I'm not gonna get drafted and have my ass sent over there to fight in combat. Enough for some stupid ass unnecessary war that we have no business being in. But later into the 70s and 1980s, things had calmed down a bit. And in those years, we spent a lot more time together. There wasn't the polarization, all the conflict and, the highly charged political rhetoric. Things were much more sedate or toned down compared to what they are now. But in the early 80s, President Ronald Reagan planted the seeds of what over time became, resulted in this extreme partisan polarization. This is inflammatory rhetoric. It's like the whole media landscape has changed. And part of the reason I'm going to address this is because this is having such an enormous effect, such a profound impact upon many of us individually, upon our society as a whole. And it's in many ways created a very toxic environment, highly dysfunctional. We're in a very destructive cycle as a result of it. With the fairness doctrine, and that stated that there had to be news outlets had to present a more fair presentation, make somewhat of a concerted effort to present the different sides of an issue. And with that, there would be more discussion and debate as to the merits or the disadvantages of different political policies or initiatives. And yet, with striking down the fairness doctrine, what happened is that opened the door for media outlets to go in this very extreme partisan direction, one direction or another. And that has harmed us in many ways. Now, when you look at the media, for instance, let's take the mainstream media to start with. And unfortunately, our mainstream media, its primary motivation is monetary, and that their intention or their baseline of operation is primarily let's attract as many viewers as possible and let's keep them tuned in for as long as we can keep them and keep them returning. Now, conservative media or right-wing media operates from the same premise, and yet with right-wing media, and I will admit, politically I am progressive. Now, I feel that education should be free. You have countries like, say, in Norway or Sweden, for instance, and everyone has the opportunity to get an education. Healthcare is covered. And so you're able to get your education and not rack up massive debt that's going to be with you for decades, that's going to take you decades to pay off. And you're not going to have individuals who, if they develop a catastrophic illness, it's not going to wipe them and their families out financially. So certain basic essentials I feel need to be covered. But anyway, when it comes to conservative or right-wing media, yes, there is a profit motive, as there is mainstream media, but with the conservative or right-wing media, what I find disturbing about it is there's also a lot of disinformation that is being propagated, a lot of lies, purposefully. And part of the reason I'm bringing this up is because many of us, as we return to our families, if we're spending time with their families, it can be quite difficult because we have family members, siblings, parents, in some instances, children, who get sucked into a lot of the inflammatory, incendiary rhetoric spewed by certain political pundits. And the first person on the scene, Rush Limbaugh, and to me, to hear him, just the sound of his voice, and there's something about, and it's very sad, just the pundits like this evoke this sense of victimization and evoke emotions such as fear and anger and even individuals like Tucker Carlson. Now, these people, there's a term for them. It's called conflict entrepreneurs or provocateurs. Either one is appropriate. And basically and they're not the only ones, and the right wing or the conservatives are not necessarily, there's a lot more when it comes to right wing conservative media, Fox, Newsmax, Breitbart, for instance. And there's a lot more disinformation, but even within other movements and to some degree, I feel to a lesser degree on the left, there are those who I feel are irresponsible. And part of it is a desire for power, to have influence over others. And sadly, this has in many respects taken over our political discourse so that we're not really having thoughtful, rational, coherent discussions where we're, again, weighing out the advantages and disadvantages, the different approaches to issues. For instance, let's take the word socialism. Socialism has become one of these, or even communism. We're referring to people as communists. Well, I spent time in the former East Germany shortly after the wall fell. And I spent time in Laos over there. They say Lao here, it's referred to as Laos with an S on the end. And what you have here, I remember back in the 80s, there were some people that identified as communists, but for the most part, there's no one in our Congress or Senate that's that is holding such a extreme left-wing position, but anything that would care for the look out or provide for the well-being of people who are basically struggling to make ends meet. For instance, to be able to earn an adequate working wage that would enable them to pay rent. Individuals that would be faced with astronomical medical expense are those who are seeking their education, that just want to better themselves. Individuals who would make an incredibly, and many do, they go on to get their education, but they end up racking up tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And you have reductionist dopes. I know I may offend some people with that comment, but reductionist dopes who say, well, I made my way through college. And it's like, well, yeah, so I did too. But the difference is you go back a couple of decades and the cost of college tuition was way lower. I mean, you could get through college very inexpensively in those days. But the cost of getting a college education has just exploded. And so by the time you come out the other side, by the time you earn that 4-year degree or the master's, or you work your way through medical school or law school, and you owe tens or even up into $100,000 or more of debt, you're saddled with that debt, and you end up spending decades of your life paying that off and stuff. But anyway, so, and part of the reason I'm bringing this up again is because here we are, we get together with our families, and invariably this comes up. And so, was it about a year ago at Christmas, one of the in-laws through a marriage, and he's all of a sudden he has this outburst, let's go, Brandon. And part of me is like, oh, fuck you. And, I had worked a couple of hours to prepare a dinner, and the asshole shows up and he's goes off with his let's go, Brandon spew. In addition to that, it's I have family members that have gotten sucked into all kinds of conspiracy theories, listening to people like Alex Jones with this InfoWars. I recently saw a portion of, was it a live stream or a broadcast in which Alex Jones was on the live stream or the broadcast with, what's his name, Soloyev, who is one of the, I'm not sure if I pronounced his name right, but he's one of the top Russian propagandists who justifies, and he's one of the main cheerleaders for the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine. And it's like the fact that tens of thousands of Ukrainians, or actually millions of Ukrainians, have been displaced, have been made refugees, have been severely traumatized by this invasion. Many, I think tens of thousands now that have been killed, children that have been abducted by the Russians, taken into Russia. Stop and imagine, what if it was your own child or children who were taken, abducted by Russian forces, and you don't know if you would ever see them again, or maybe you would never see them again. And Alex Jones, on a broadcast with Russia's top propagandist, And the same man who, after the Sandy Hook massacre, was claiming that it was a false flag, that they were all crises actors, that there was no massacre that took place. And here you have the parents. You have the children, these kindergartners, first graders killed. And I'm not sure, some of the faculty at the school as well. And yet Alex Jones denies this trauma. You have the parents of these children who were killed. And so Alex Jones's followers calling, harassing, making death threats against the parents of these children, the parents who have already suffered this horrific trauma that will never get over the loss of their own children. And Alex Jones completely denying the irrefutable reality of the fact that these children were massacred by someone who was mentally unstable and went in with an AR-15 and shot to death a whole bunch of children. And many of us, we have family members who listen to people like Alex Jones, or who buy into other insane conspiracy theories, Pizzagate, or QAnon, that have absolutely no basis in reality. And sometimes you're just sitting there and you do anything just to change the topic, change the subject, try to go off, talk about someone else, but you can't always do so. Sometimes it's very difficult. Many of us grew up, we come from a religious background. I grew up in the Christian evangelical church, and in many ways that was traumatic for me. At the age of 10, I was taken to have a little conversation with our minister. The minister is telling me at that young age, is saying, if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you are going to burn in hell for all eternity. I'm like 10 years old. Imagine you're a child and you're being given this message. And a minister at that time, you see that individual as a person, he's in a position of authority. And what does he know that I don't know? And so even from that young age, and as I was growing into adolescence, I'm like thinking like, I don't want to burn in hell for all eternity. But there's also another part of me is thinking, wow, what a fucking asshole of a God that would relegate the larger masses of humanity to burn in eternal damnation in the lake of fire. Because these supposed his first human beings that he created, this, according to the mythology, Adam and Eve, listened to this nefarious being, Satan or Lucifer, and ate the forbidden fruit. And so therefore humanity is doomed to, is for that reason, all the offspring of Adam and Eve are inherently sinful and doomed to eternal damnation. And this whole narrative of like God sending his son to in order to save humanity. And it sounds pretty crazy to me. I mean, just as I grew older and I began to question. And I know I've spent time in India, in Sri Lanka, spent time in China. And you have this whole, these vast nations with billions of people. And yet you think like, okay, all these folks, they're going to burn in hell for all eternity. Really, you think about it too, like supposedly humanity, if there's truth to the archaeological evidence, humanity has been here for millions of years. And when you begin to study historical accounts, the archaeology and the history, Christianity and even Judaism is really not very old. Christianity goes back about 2,000 years. Judaism, from historical accounts or the documentation, whatever, historically, what we think of as the Old Testament, I guess in Judaism, that would be called the Torah. Forgive me if I'm a little ignorant here, but I think that was put together something like about 8 centuries BC. And according to many historians who study the biblical history, there's actually no historical record of a figure named Moses. I mean, there's no documentation to prove his existence. And when they examined the records in Egypt during that, over the thousands of years of ancient Egyptian civilization, there was no record of this large mass of people of Hebrew, Jewish, whatever. And so there is some speculation that, it could be possible that maybe there was a small group that was held in captivity in Egypt and managed to somehow escape. And over time, that story or those legends were embellished. I think most of us at some point have played that game where we sit in circles in a chair and one person tells a story or narrative to the next person, and then that person tells to the next, and then to the next, and to the next. And, for many centuries or even thousands of years, and you go far enough back, there was no written language, and we didn't have paper, and we certainly didn't have any kind of digital mediums to store information. And so these narratives, these stories get distorted. I was reading or listening to a fascinating book by Francesca, if I pronounce her name right, Stavrokopoulou, and is called God in Anatomy. and she was describing, and some historians, for instance, there's a lot of debate on this, and that some have argued that the people of Israel, of Judea, originally were an offshoot of the Canaanite people, and that the deity, our Judeo-Christian deity that we think of as God, within the Judaic tradition, this deity that we think of as God was referred to as Yahweh, or has been referred to as Yahweh. I think there was they wouldn't spell out the name, and so the vowels are missing or something like that, and so they just kind of deducted that pronunciation was Yahweh from that tradition. And so historically, what they were saying is Yahweh was actually one of 70 siblings within a Canaanite pantheon. Yahweh was the son of the supreme deity, Al. And there are a number of biblical names for God, for instance, like El Shaddai, El as in Al. But again, within the Canaanite pantheon, Al was the supreme deity. Ashura was his wife, and they had 70 children, of which uh, Yahweh was one of these 70 siblings. And all these little different groups, the Israelites, the Hittites, I don't remember all the others, but they have their sort of like patron deity in a similar way, like you go in India and in different regions or different little groups or subgroupings of people, some of the tribal groups referred to as Adivasi, they have these patron deities. And in a similar way, the people of Israel, Judea, had this patron deity, which was Yahweh. Yahweh was a war or a storm god. And many, many years ago, there was actually in a graven image or an idol in this book, which I have a copy of here, God in Anatomy. I'll hold it closer to the camera so you can see there is actually an idol or a graven image for the deity Yahweh. But at a certain point, there was, I think there was a movement that was taking place through different religions. I think it was happening in Greece, and then also in the in the Judaic religious circles that is saying that, oh no, our deity cannot be represented in form. Our deity is therefore cannot be seen, is unseen. And so they dispensed of the idols. There was something similar in Saudi Arabia, in that they also had a diverse pantheon of deities. And then when Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, came in, he had all of those other deities dispensed of, and they, he was saying that there is only one God, who is Allah, and in a similar way, Allah cannot be seen. So, because I grew up in this Christian evangelical church, and in many respects, it was traumatic for me. It was like, there are instances where they would have me down in the front of the church, and you'd have all these people with their hands all over me, and they're just, crying out, saying things like, Satan, get your hands off of him. He's God's child, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, basically, they're trying to cast Satan out of me. And it's like, I'm just this adolescent kid, just doing the best I could to make sense of life in this world, and to grow into adulthood. But I grew up in that crazy. And so in many respects, as I look back, I feel that I grew up in a cult. And to me, the only real distinction between a cult and a religion is just the number of adherents. It's just certain cults just really caught on. And so part of the challenge I have, may seem that I'm going off on a tangent, is that so many aspects of our society are based upon these mythologies that have been constructed over the decades, over the centuries, over millennia. And we base our lives upon these mythologies. And there's, having studied hypnosis and neurolinguistic programming, there's a term that they use to the question that is often asked is a particular intervention where a practitioner is going to intervene or to strive to address an issue on somebody's behalf, or maybe try to influence them in some way. And the question that many of the teachers have taught students to ask themselves is this intervention ecological? What are the impacts? What are the consequences thereof? Now, when you think about, as Europeans came to the Americas, and also to Australia, to New Zealand, to the island nation of Tasmania as well, there is this doctrine of manifest destiny, for instance. And manifest destiny was like, we have a God-given right to come here and to colonize and to spread across the land to assert our dominion. But Native Americans were not regarded as human beings, or maybe were regarded as less than. So therefore, it's okay to kill them. It's okay to take their land. And in Tasmania, the indigenous population was completely exterminated. There are no surviving native Tasmanians in existence. I think the last of them died out maybe around 1860s, 1870s. Australian Aboriginals, I think also most Australian Aboriginals were wiped out. Native Americans here in, I think, the United States, I think the population was something like 45 million at the time that Europeans first arrived. And by 1900, I think there were just under 1 million left. Most died as a result of disease because they did not have immunity to Western diseases. Most of our infectious diseases are smallpox, measles, I forget whether it's syphilis or gonorrhea, which one originated with animals. But, and they say even AIDS originated from monkeys. Possibly, I don't know that they know for sure, but people eating bushmeat. But Europeans, Africans, Asians, Middle Easterners, all having domesticated animals, pigs, sheep, horses, cattle. Native Americans did not have domestic animals other than the dog. And in Central South America, they had the llama and the alpaca. And so therefore had not developed the immune system and were highly susceptible to the infectious diseases that were brought over by the Europeans. And so disease killed the vast majority, but then you had many, many incidences of massacres in which, villages of people were just brutally slaughtered. And so we need to question our belief systems. Another example, many of us, we grew up, who grew up in the Christian church have long heard the hymn Amazing Grace. That Amazing Grace was actually written or composed by a slave trader. The man who wrote that song was, at the time they were abducting Native Africans, beating them, shackling them together, and transporting them in the hold of these slave ships. And along this very long, arduous journey, many of them became ill and many of them died. And so as a slave, or someone who was taken into slavery, many of these individuals would be shackled next to others who were seriously ill or that had died. Those who were ill in many instances were taken and thrown overboard. And because the slavers were afraid that others would become ill. And then these enslaved Africans were sold like as livestock, basically. Many instances, the children of enslaved Africans were sold off. And so imagine if you were to give birth to your own children, or imagine the children you had given birth to, imagine them being sold off. And you knew that they were being sold into slavery, and that subjected to all kinds of brutality. And in addition, you would never see or hear from them again. You had no idea what had become of them, other than that they too were subjected to the same kind of horrific conditions. And even after slavery, during the Reconstruction and all that, it's many of these formerly enslaved Africans, many of them were lynched and were terrorized, were killed. And because of growing up in the evangelical Christian church, I felt in many respects I had to stage an intervention for myself. There's a man I have a lot of admiration for, Stephen Hassan, who was a devout Moonie. He was a member of Reverend Sung Young Moon's Reunification Church. And he nearly died in a car collision, and his family staged an intervention. And so in many respects, I felt like I basically did an intervention on myself. And part of my putting my head together after going through all that was studying Christianity as well as other religions from a more historical standpoint. And I would encourage you to do the same. If you're going to believe something, I feel it's grossly irresponsible just to believe, to just take on these beliefs. And it's like, well, why do you believe that? How do you know that to be the case? Oh, I just have faith. Well, no. Be a responsible human being and research your belief. What validity does this have? Where does this originate? I was listening to another book, The Midnight Kingdom by Jared Yates Sexton, and he was talking about the history of the early church, and he was describing the insanity of all the crazy ass conspiracies. And even then, the early Christians were perpetrating these acts of anti-Semitism against the Jewish community in Europe at the time. Those people weren't inspired. They didn't have any divine inspiration. They were just absolutely fucking nuts. But again, the book is The Midnight Kingdom. And another historian of the Bible is Bart, and I think his last name is spelled Ehrman, Ehrman. And there's a number of books that you could find of his on Amazon. I find them incredibly fascinating to listen to him, the lectures that he's given. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that many of us, as we go and we return to spend time with our families of origin, many of us, our families are still steeped in these religions, and they want us to go to church with them. They're still trying to reconvert us. They're trying to bring us back into the fold, and so that can be rather uncomfortable at times. And now again, everybody's experience is I feel at times it's as though we live in different universes. Our individual experience varies to such a great degree. As I said, if you're starting out, you've partnered with someone and you're raising a child or your own children, and that can be a very warm and special time that you have together over the holidays. Maybe you have your immediate family that you're raising, and then you're getting together with your own or family of origin or that of your partners. And it's, for grandparents and children to get to spend time together. I mean, it can be a very wonderful experience. And I have a lot of fond memories of accounts that I heard that my grandfather was an absolute monster when um, in his day, but from what I knew of him by that time, he was suffering from, um, I believe, lung cancer and emphysema, and he was actually very kind to me during that time. But I have fond memories of that time that I got to spend with him, and I think he loved me very much. And but but many of us, as we get together with our families, and it can be quite challenging sometimes, and so and they're going to say and they're going to do things that trigger us. And even just spending time over the holidays, maybe we're there for a few days or a week or even longer, and sometimes conflicts arise. I have family members that can be pretty dramatic sometimes, generate unnecessary drama. They seem to thrive on it. And also a bit narcissistic. That can be very difficult to be around. One of my family members asked me at one point and said, "So what are your New Year's resolutions?" And that felt very invasive to me. And I just responded by saying, "Well, that's very personal, and it's not something that I really want to share." And this particular family member said to me, "Well, my New Year's resolutions for you," which I cut that individual off, that family member, and said, "That's very narcissistic of you." At which that family member exploded at me and started shouting. I stood there as this family member shouting at me, and I just dropped my awareness into my body. I was just feeling my body and the whole range of feelings I was experiencing in the moment and physical sensations, and I was just breathing very softly, very deeply. And that was helping me to stay grounded. You see, like if in these situations where I've had family members and other people I've known where they would tend to escalate. So if I react, it's going to escalate the drama. It's going to become even more explosive. And so, in order to de escalate, I dropped into my body and I began to breathe very softly, very deeply, and to follow the feelings and sensations. Normally, I teach these meditation practices. I say, sit down, close your eyes, bring that person to your awareness. And there's other variations. I just have people tune into their physical body, all their feelings and sensations, but it's going to look weird if you try to do that when you're in the midst of a conversation, when you're sitting at the dinner table for Thanksgiving, Christmas, or New Year's, or if you're just in some other context, you're having a conversation. So I encourage you to do the same thing here. While you're in the midst of a conversation, as I did, just drop into your body. What do you feel? Like, what are the feelings? What are the sensations? As I did that, I just kept breathing. And it helped me to calm down a bit. And there's this phenomenon, it's called sympathetic resonance. As I got into a calmer state, it helped to de-escalate the situation. I think this other individual, as I was looking into their eyes, I think from their end, they're like, he sees through me. He sees that I'm just crazy. And I think it made them feel a bit uncomfortable, which good. They should feel uncomfortable because it is crazy and it's grossly inappropriate. But I just kept breathing, de-escalated the situation. Now there was a time, like a few years later, with the same family member, where this individual was really on the attack. And that's the problem when you're dealing with narcissists. A lot of times they can be very intrusive. And there's a way that they just keep pushing, keep taking more ground. But at that point, when I was being verbally assaulted, it was like a vicious attack. By that point, it pushed me to my limits, and I exploded in that instance. And I don't like to explode. I like to be calm and relaxed and work things out and be easygoing. But in that instance, I was just pushed to the breaking point. But it turned out to be a good thing because it actually set some very important limits. It helped to establish a boundary. And this particular family member is like, wow, I can't, he does have some anger, and I can't push beyond a certain boundary, or it's like kablooey, it's going to blow up on me. So yeah, anger has a purpose. And another example is there are times where I faced mugging attempts, and I went ballistic and I went on the attack against the attacker, and it saved my ass. It scared the shit out of them. So yeah, sometimes anger serves a very essential purpose, as it did in these instances. But again, as I said before, spending time with family is like, it can evoke a whole range of emotional responses. There's like, sometimes some of us, we have a deep love for members of our family, and there are those of us who are fortunate to be very close and have a very strong love and connection. We have parents that, for instance, that were very supportive and loving. We have siblings that we have close connections with, and it's just such a wonderful experience to get together with them again whenever we have the opportunity to do so. And often we're separated by distance, and we have all these demands and responsibilities, and it just doesn't give us as much time as we need to be together. And then most of us, there's a fair degree of ambiguity. Our parents loved us the best we could, and maybe we loved our siblings and our aunties and uncles and grandparents, and they were doing the best they could themselves, but there are some issues, there are some difficulties, there are unresolved conflicts. Some of us grew up with parents and other family members that abused us in some way, even if they did love us, or maybe they didn't love us in some cases. But out of guilt or obligation, we're seeing people that, and sometimes we wish we weren't seeing them, and some wish they never had to see their family members. I also have a lot of compassion for, I know many instances where parents, and I know some of these parents that I know them very well, that they were very giving and were there in every way they could possibly be for their children, and made great sacrifices. And I know they're very decent, very good people, but we're living in an age where relationships are disposable, and some of these parents are estranged from their children, and it's extraordinarily painful for these parents. because they deeply love their children. And I know they gave, you know, did the best they could. No parent is perfect. No one is perfect, but so we have all these different realities. But in any case, what situation do you find yourself in during the holidays? Do you have family to gather with? And what's it like? Is there a tremendous amount of love and closeness, and you feel overjoyed to have this opportunity to reconnect? Is it just weird because you're with people and you have all these ambiguous feelings? There's all this unresolved conflict and you don't quite know how to address it, and there are issues that cannot be discussed. Are they into some weird ass conspiracies that have absolutely no basis in reality? Are they part of some weird religious cult? Are they still into some fundamentalist religion? Are they have they been, have their brains been taken over by are they part of the MAGA cult, and and they're indoctrinated by the right-wing media, and you just can no longer have any kind of sane, rational conversation with them? Are you spending the holidays alone because you just don't have anyone to be with? Now, if you are spending time with your family, whatever the circumstance or condition, I mean, for me, sometimes it's been rather uncomfortable. I feel that the relationships have improved, which is a good thing. And there is more closeness than there was in times past. And but one of the things that I find really valuable about getting to spend time with family is that when you return to your family of origin, it gives you the opportunity to see where you came from. You understand, like, oftentimes we tend to enact certain dynamics in our adult relationships. It could be in our professional relationships, and especially in our intimate romantic relationships. We may, and we often do, if we ever have children, we may enact some of the same kind of relational behavioral dynamics that our parents enacted with us, or maybe we flip to the opposite extreme and we try to behave in a completely different, 180-degree opposite way of the way our parents interacted with us or treated us or something. But when we could return to our family of origin, it gives us a very good opportunity to really get a sense of where we came from. And it helps the fact that it puts us in touch with a lot of feelings, and sometimes those feelings, those issues can be very uncomfortable. We tend to want to forget that and wish it would go away, but actually we need to go there. When we can be present with it, it gives us a very good opportunity to address some of these issues and to get back in touch with parts of us that we have disconnected from. And as I've said many times before, bring your full awareness, go there to those issues. Actually go there. And how do you feel? What does it feel like physically? What sensations are you experiencing in your body? What kinds of emotions are coming up? And bring your full awareness to those emotions and physical sensations. Being fully immersed, breathe softly and deeply into what you're feeling, and that will help you to gain a lot of insight and understanding. You also need to educate yourself. If you're dealing with these crazy ass dysfunctional dynamics, then read up on it. If you have, you grew up with parents, for instance, who were narcissistic, if you were neglected, if you were subjected to some kind of trauma, if there are other forms of dysfunction, read up on it. Educate yourself. Do the practice. Again, when you're sitting by yourself and You have time to reflect. If you go out for a walk, be breathing into the feelings. Even in the midst of a conversation, you're having a conversation, you're sitting at the dinner table over Thanksgiving or Christmas or New Year's, and feelings are being triggered. Well, how does that feel? And breathe into those feelings. And one thing that I've noticed is, growing up, I'm not that much of a sports fan, but during football and basketball, baseball games, which baseball is a different time of the year. It's a wide world of sports, and you see those downhill skiers coming off the ramp and crashing and burning and breaking multiple bones, and they would do this slow motion replay. And what I found is that when I start breathing like that, it has this effect of just slowing down time. So it gives me the opportunity to reflect upon what I'm going to say. It's like, well, do I need to say anything here? And what do I need to say? What words do I actually need, or what message do I need to impart to have a greater impact, or to convey what I want this other person to understand of what I'm thinking and feeling? Is there any point in saying anything at all? Or is it better, are you dealing with someone who just cannot possibly even hear what you're going to say? And in that case, sometimes I just let it go. And there are times where I've just have made the choice not to deal with certain family members because they're invasive and they're assholes and repeatedly violating boundaries. And it's like, I'm just not going to deal with them. But if I can, as much as possible, I like to preserve relationships. I encourage you, if at all possible, that you do as well. Or if you have family members that are caught up in the MAGA cult and all the extreme right-wing rhetoric, the disinformation being spewed by Fox News and WND. I'm not sure what that it's supposed to stand for, but some of us refer to it as Wingnut Daily. And let's see, Breitbart and all these other even one of the editors of Breitbart, he was for some time he was an advisor to Trump, Stephen K. Bannon. And Bannon himself, he's a great admirer of Mussolini, I think Stalin, and he himself, there's a quote, was "flood the zone with shit," which is basically saying, just throw out so much garbage into the media sphere. And what will happen is it will overwhelm people and confuse them. And some people will buy into the bullshit. And there are others that will just get so overwhelmed, and it will just shut them down cognitively, and they'll just give up, and they'll think that there's no truth. And what's the point of understanding? And you can't do anything. And they feel hopeless about it. And so they give up. And so, but anyway, if you have family members who buy into Alex Jones and InfoWars and QAnon, or they're into some crazy ass fundamentalist religion, and you can't get through to them, sometimes there's just no point in saying anything. But when you can, I mean, one of my mottos is reach those you can, entertain the rest. Do the best you can to communicate. I feel we're at a very crucial juncture in history. And sometimes I feel all points of time are crucial junctions in history, but especially now. If you hear, for instance, some of Trump's rhetoric and some of his statements verbatim are actually, and I've heard his statements from his campaign rallies, and then I would see the verbatim how he was making the same statements as Adolf Hitler. That I don't have it up right now, but his Um, I will rid the country of vermin and the threat from within. And these are pretty much the exact same statements as Adolf Hitler in the 1930s and in 1940s. It was, Jews were demonized, and you have like Fox News and the right-wing media, and they demonize immigrants. And there's all this like white replacement theory. And how sadly, these bombastic, as I said, conflict entrepreneurs or provocateurs, what they do is they spew this incendiary rhetoric, and it provokes it all this fear and anger, and people get into their tribal identification of us and them and those people and all that, and Democrats are demonized, and um, all that. And it just gets crazy as hell. And so when we spend time, this is why I'm going into all this stuff, because a lot of us were spending time over the holidays with family members, and it's stressful as hell sometimes. And not only that, then you have too all the commercialization. It seems like year after year it just gets earlier. It used to be where, I don't know, I forget, going back to the 60s and 70s when they started promoting Christmas, but now, damn, like mid-November, and it's everything is so commercialized. First, there is this, even you go back far enough, Christmas itself was not the supposed birthday of Christ. It was actually the equinox. It's supposed to be around the time of the equinox, and that was what was considered a sacred ceremony among various pagan groups. But in order to what's the word, subvert or supplant the whole pagan mythology or something, they said, oh, we'll co-opt that, and we'll make the birth of Christ, or the celebration of Christ's birth at the time of this, not equinox, but the solstice, the winter solstice. And, so crazy. And then as time goes on, and instead of celebrating the supposed birth of Christ, which, really wasn't around that time of year anyway, it was just like, you have all these, the corporate interests, that were like commercializing the media, selling advertisements, the ad dollar revenue generated, and the profits for goods being sold. And so all this has become so commercialized. So in many respects, it's like we have this whole society that is based upon this multiple levels of mythology that has been concocted, and also just the whole commercialization. And then you have, again, we get together with family, and they're steeped in their conspiracies and their religions, which are based on mythologies. And so, yeah, it triggers the hell out of us, and sometimes, and so it's a very mixed bag. So I've gone on for quite some time. A lot to think about, a lot to reflect on. My intention wasn't to offend anyone. I'm sure maybe I had. If by chance you still happen to be with me, you found value in what I had to say, then hey, like the video. You might even subscribe to my YouTube channel, whatever. But again, I've said a lot. Just chew on it, digest what I've said, and yeah, use this opportunity to, when you're getting together with your family, to reflect back on yourself, see how the whole family dynamics, and see how you can see yourself reflected in your individual family members and all that. And again, the family dynamics and what you can learn. I always see it as a reflection too of, as I said, of how I've grown. And so there's a lot to learn, and use it as an opportunity. For me, when I am triggered, when I do find these, somehow they say or do things, family members that trigger me, I'm going to work with that, and I'm going to use it as a means to to further my own understanding of myself and my own healing and growth. I encourage you to do the same. And I am going to leave you with that. Bye for now.